I'm kind of mostly on the ground version of the food security system. How many people here have foraged for foods before? Okay, this is something that we've been doing for, depending on who you talk to, 10 to 20,000 years, so it's nothing new. And a lot of times it gets lumped into sort of the non-traditional agricultural model, but in fact it's the traditional first model we ever used. And my sort of context for the talk is about risk, but it's hard for me because I'm very optimistic. So I like to talk about potential, a few risks, but I think one of the most interesting things about the wild food world, and I work a lot with First Nation bands and educating people. I think it's a knowledge base that has been eroded over time by things like traditional agriculture. So it's something that we really have to work on re-educating people on. So there are lots of great things out there, lots of courses, and I think an example of a great garden that we have in Duncan, in one of the park, we put up a wild foods walk with labels, and it's somewhere people can tour through, and it's a pretty interesting thing, particularly when you're talking about educating the youth and getting people to just wrap their minds around the fact that food is available at our feet, and many times it's far more nutritious than the food we're growing in our gardens. So there are lots of challenges. It's a huge topic, and I think one of the things is it is very complex. There are foods that can kill you, things that can make you very ill, and things that can vastly improve your health. And it's all wrapped up in one bundle. And that's where that traditional knowledge, not just local First Nations, because in many ways they were pretty blessed to have a huge abundance of food. So it's not like other areas of the planet where you had to sort of scrape and really fight for every scrap of nutrient you get. There was an overabundance at times of food here. So a lot of the First Nation knowledge really revolves around foods that were medicinal or sacred or very important to their cultural applications. So those types of foods, particularly the medicinal ones, that's a resource that is somewhat at risk. A lot of those plants are fragile, come from fragile ecosystems, so they're not what I think is going to be solving any kind of food security issue. But there are lots of things that are abundant, particularly things that have been introduced. So the whole world of what people call weeds is pretty fascinating. A lot of the weeds were introduced by settlers or brought in through natural methods. They expanded and they took over the landscape. So a great example would be things like dandelions or oxeye daisy or even blackberries. So if any of you have had the famous Cowichan blackberry port, it's from the Himalayan blackberry, which was introduced to this country maybe 150 years ago, and now it's sort of choked everything. But lots of medicinal benefits, lots of nutrients, something that people probably would encourage you to cut down and harvest as a resource. So please interrupt me with any questions you have. I have a lot of useless information in my mind.
Yes, where is the Duncan?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's right in downtown Duncan. I can't really tell you the street. If you want to follow up with me later, I can tell you. But they just built a wood-burning cob oven, and it's an old park that was a playground, and now it's a community garden. Aldley Street. Yes. Anyway, so I think that some of the challenges from foraging. The first thing people bring up is the resource sustainable? And it's a very complex question. For some things, it is incredibly sustainable. For other things, it is very fragile. So it's a real mixed bag. I think that when we're talking about foraging, it's well, I'm trying to put it politically correctly here. By far the largest challenge is not people picking things, it's habitat destruction. So the number one thing on that list for Vancouver Island is forestry. Forestry is a traditional timber use of forests, and it is at direct odds with this non-traditional or non-timber use of forests. So once you cut down a forest, it's affecting a pretty complex ecosystem. So things that are really affected right off the bat are mushrooms. Mushrooms rely on lots of nutrients, moisture, moss. When the forest is cut down, that whole area is opened up to a lot of sunlight. Other plants come in, but the mushroom resource definitely is staggered for 20 or 30 years. It tends to come back, but we never see the same diversity of growth in second and third growth forests that we do in old growth forests. And old growth forests are endangered, I should say. So when trees are cut down, things like salal, fireweed, lots of great edible plants come back in abundance. So the biomass actually is increased, and a lot of edible plants come into that mix when a forest is cut down. But certain things, particularly flower bulbs, things like camas, those things are a pretty fragile resource. But there are lots of things out there that can be used to put into the food system, but more importantly, used to create jobs in remote communities, to add value to these products. And I think that's one of the reasons where we're sort of falling down, is we still view a lot of these wild foods as commodities, whereas what they really should be used as are ways to generate economic benefit to communities, and that brings a whole bunch of other things into the mix. But very little work is done in that area. That's one thing that I'm starting to do. We do lots of work in remote communities. A lot of it revolves around dehydrating. One of the challenges of these products is that they're fragile. So when you're adding value to something, you're looking at doing things like extending the shelf life of products. It also helps capture a lot of the nutrients, phytonutrients. A lot of the goodness of these products is still preserved while drying.
I have a question.
Sure.
Salal takes about 5 to 7 years before the berries come ready. And right now, there's so much exploitation of the salal for florists and stuff.
Right.
Is there anything that's being done to set aside areas where they can't just rip it out for florists and stuff?
It's an interesting question, but a lot of times when they're pruning for salal, it's not just destructing the plant; it's really just pruning it. So it, in many ways, it encourages growth. Now, berries are a different story, but for salal growth, I would say it's pretty robust and present all through the island, and not something that I would think would be very much endangered. But the trees around it, yes. The other berry that is quite interesting to me and gets very little attention is Oregon grape. And both Oregon grape and salal, they're food for wildlife, more importantly. So bears and salal are very, very tightly linked together. It's a very, very good food for them. Oregon grape, another berry that when you first try it on the vine, it has a very sour, bitter component to it. But it's tested to be almost off the charts for antioxidants and a very, very incredibly nutritious mix. So those are foods that people are not really exploiting too much, even in the First Nation world. This introduced blackberry because it's so abundant. There's lots of berries. Those are the kind of fruits that they tend to go to because it's easy to pick 100 pounds of blackberries. It's more difficult to pick a lot of salal or Oregon grape. But anyway, I don't want to say your question's not valid, but I would say one of the most robust plants on this island is salal.
No, I just know that I spend a lot of time, I make salal jam and things like that. And when I go out to the bush a lot of times, yes, it prunes it, but there are just leaves. And the other thing is I see a lot of people just pull out the whole plant, take it to the road and prune it. I found so many dead salal.
Yeah, no, there's people that do all kinds of stuff like that. But it depends where you're going. And the way I look at it with wild foods, if you want the best quality wild foods, you have to go as far away from people as possible. So if you're going to an area that's currently visited, it can be compromised in many ways. One of them is from the destruction of the resource. But this is a pretty big country, a big island, and I've traveled lots of back roads. The human impact is minimal. It might be less than 1%. The big impact is from the destruction of the forests from logging. And I have nothing against logging. It's a necessary thing. But I think it's one of the ways we value our forests. We don't look at them as food forests, food production systems. We look at them as timber or toilet paper. And that may or may not change. I want to talk about a few things that are quite abundant that we're seeing more interest in. One of them, and these are fairly sustainable. So things like needles of grand fir, Douglas fir, high in vitamin C. We make tea out of grand fir needles that is delicious and it's an amazing product. We use it for seasoning all kinds of stuff. It's something that could easily be pruned. You can create essential oils from it. It can be used to add value to a lot of different products. You could make salal and grand fir needle jam, and it would be incredibly good. So that's something that is out there. Not valuing forests just for the timber we can get out of it. Mushrooms, one of the biggest mushroom productions in terms of money is probably from the pine mushroom. That's the matsutake, and that really is almost so because almost all the mushrooms were exported to Japan at one time. But now there's local markets building up for it.
Do you mainly use in your own work? And do you do your own foraging, or do you have people who do that for you?
Both, and we do a demonstration farm, so we use almost all the products we can. We try to avoid products that are fragile, so we don't work with a lot of wildflower bulbs, things like that, camas, things that may have traditionally been used, but I don't think it's responsible to use those products today. So, but other than that, we use everything in a wide variety. And we have foragers who pick for us. Some people will give us essential oils. We try to incorporate all that stuff as much as possible. So our farm really works on the sort of the mantra of local products above all. So we work with local farmers, foragers, First Nations, and that all comes together on the table at our place. So it's education, and it's also feeding people good, nutritious food. So yes, everything.
Wondering about newly introduced invasive plants, so-called invasive plants, and if you have seen any market for things like Japanese knotweed or gallweed, and if so, does that kind of make you run against the invasive plant?
No, I don't think we'd run up against them. They'd probably be happy you're harvesting them. Yeah, many of these plants that are invasive were brought here as a food source, as a pot herb, as medicinal herb. Things like dandelion is not native to North America. It was brought here and exploded all over the planet. And those things, they're fairly abundant. I think they're worth seeking out. And it's ironic that many of the things we call weeds are far more nutritious than the vegetables, some of the vegetables we grow in our own gardens. So there's lots of plants out there that are highly nutritious. One thing you have to keep in mind is that it's a wild product, so you're not able to regulate it. It's outside of the world of a lot of regulations. You can't control what happens to that plant. So the closer you are to civilization, the more chance that resource could be compromised, polluted, or compromised in some way. So these plants readily absorb pollutants, heavy metals, herbicides, pesticides. So like I said before, the best sources of these plants are not maybe on the sidewalk in front of your house. It's a bit of a contradiction, even though they're nutritious and they're fantastic. You could grow them in raised beds, or you could, on our farm, we're lucky, we can just go around and we can harvest stuff all around the place. Oxeye daisy is one of my favorite. I don't know if you know about that at all. It's a plant that's introduced and it spreads all through the Cowichan Valley. Fruits beautifully twice a year, in the springtime and in the fall. And if you pick a leaf and put it in your mouth, it tastes just like a sweet, tart green apple. And so it's an amazing addition to salads, far better than dandelion or all those ones. But anyway, these are the foods that are at our feet, and a lot of the barrier to using those foods is probably from the lack of knowledge most of us have. A lot of people are generally just afraid of things that they don't understand, and I think that wild foods definitely fall into that category. It doesn't come in a supermarket that often packaged, so it's something you either have to seek for yourself, or go to a farmer's market, or have sort of a collective effort to go to harvest these plants.
Do you know if the BC model is online or if it's still available? Is anybody doing that?
I think the funding stopped for that about 4 years ago, but through Rural Roads, there was a BC Wilds Wild Foods directory. It's probably still online, but they haven't updated it in many years. So this was a place for people who are producing jams, jellies, sourcing products to go and put a listing or find out people who are providing products you need. So it was a way of connecting them all together, and it was an amazing program, but the funding stopped for it about 2008, I think. Yes. Any more questions? Well, it's what's it called?
It's called the Wild Foods Directory.
Wild Foods Directory through Rural Roads. Yes.
And I agree with Bill. I don't know if the director's current, but if you're looking for people for inspiration as to how to add value to wild foods, there's people all over the province who make product.
Yes. But unfortunately, it's like the Wild West industry. It's totally unregulated, and it's a moving target. So what was there 4 years ago is probably not there today. More in my risks assessment, it's definitely, again, comes back to knowledge. There's a few books out there. I would highly recommend 2 books written by Nancy Turner on coastal food system. She's an amazing lady, and she's sort of preserving a lot of that First Nation knowledge. Highly recommended. And the other thing that we need to do is work together to preserve and extend the harvest of some of these wild foods. So that's something that I've been involved with for many years. When I was in Vancouver, I was one of the founding members of Farm Folk City Folk, and we worked a lot with Coastal Health to put together community kitchens. And some of those involve wild foods or preserving. And I think that's a concept that has lots of merit because it allows people to connect and network. There are mainly women, but maybe a few men can get in there as well. And it's sort of something to share the experience of foraging and to build some bonds at the same time. And I think it was an incredibly worthwhile project and one that probably should be duplicated everywhere.